The evolution of banks. The rich had lots of gold and were able to buy with their gold whatever they wanted to buy. For example, they used a piece of that gold to buy a year's supply of bread from the baker. The baker then gave a piece of his piece of gold to the miller for a year's supply of flour. The miller gave some of his gold to the farmer for a year's supply of wheat. The farmer was then able to buy his plows, shovels, and horseshoes needed for his farming from the blacksmith. Eventually, the miner got some of this gold for selling the iron ore that he mined. With this gold, the baker, miller, farmer, blacksmith, and miner were all able to pay the carpenters for building their houses and the shoemakers and tailors for making their shoes and clothes. Carpenters, shoemakers, and tailors were also able to pay the tanners, weavers, and lumberjacks for leather, cloth, and wood they needed to make their products. Most of the gold eventually returned back to the rich in the form of taxes that were paid by everyone for paying soldiers to ensure that the economy ran smoothly and securely. In order to protect gold from being stolen, the rich paid people called bankers to store it for them. The bankers felt good about what they were doing. They were helping to circulate wealth from where it was, from the rich, to where it needed to be, to the poor. The bankers gave out receipts that were used by the rich to retrieve their gold whenever they needed some for buying something. Some rich people started to pay for the things that they bought with their receipts to make it more convenient for all concerned. People adopted the idea of using these receipts to buy things with instead of using the actual gold. The banks, seeing that their receipts moved around much more and easier than the gold they were guarding, they started to print more receipts for gold than they had gold. They put pictures of their kings on these receipts and called them money. The kings liked this idea very much, and so did the banks. The people also liked this idea and started to save their money just like the rich were saving their gold. And just like the rich used the vaults of the banks to safely store their gold, the people started to use the vaults of the banks to safely store their money. The bankers eventually became banksters. The banksters eventually got out of the business of storing gold and got into the business of printing money. The rich eventually stopped using their gold to buy things with and instead used the money that the banks printed. The rich started to borrow the money people lent to the banks. The banksters felt good about what they were doing. They were helping circulate wealth from the many poor to the few rich for their projects that claim to benefit society. The rich used the borrowed money to build schools to indoctrinate children. The children were put in kindergartens at a very early age to be cultivated and prepared for schools for the next 13 years to be trained as obedient and useful slaves. The rich used mass media to brainwash the slaves to be complacent. Hundreds of entertainment channels were made freely available for them to passively watch. They built the slaves factories to work in and to earn money to put into the banks for the rich to borrow. They built the slaves trains and gave them work to dig coal mines to make the trains run and to carry them to new lands to exploit. They built the slaves roads and sold them cars and gave them work to dig oil mines to make their cars run. And the slaves rejoiced and felt free as they drove around and crashed into each other, killing and injuring themselves. Some started to complain. The banksters then financed the rich to set up offices where the people could register their complaints. The offices were called governments, and those who listened to the complaints were called politicians. The politicians were selected by the slaves, and they gave the slaves empty promises that made the slaves feel free. The banksters felt good about what they were doing. They were helping finance companies that promised to channel new technologies to make the world into a better place. The new technologies that the scientists were discovering and that the engineers were implementing were so powerful that they attracted the attention and the greed of the rich. The rich then bribed and manipulated the governments to fight against each other with weapons that they sold. The governments convinced the slaves to fight to the death for their imagined freedom. The banksters printed money to finance wars that destroyed entire cities, and the rich made a lot of money rebuilding all of the destruction. Then the banksters got very greedy. Instead of financing companies that promised long-term benefits to society, the banksters financed companies that promised short-term gains to themselves. And whenever they made bad speculative investments and ended up losing their investments, they convinced the governments that they were too important to be allowed to fail and got bailed out. The governments just asked the banks to print more and more money to pay for their ever-increasing debts. The banksters felt good about being so successfully rich and being regarded as too important to fail. Then, fortunately, some very clever slaves devised a system of finance that did not need banks and their banksters at all. They used theories of mathematics dealing with cryptology that allowed numbers to be coded in such a way as to make it impossible to break the code and falsify. They used the computer technology along with the internet that allowed worldwide communications possible between any computers. They used peer-to-peer technology that allowed all computers to become bookkeepers of money transactions so that in the end, no one bookkeeper was able to falsify the books. Using mathematics, computers, and the internet, they wrote a protocol for decentralized digital money to be transferred as easily as messages in an email. Just like email revolutionized the sending and receiving of mail to make it fast, secure, and cheap, the new protocol they called Bitcoin revolutionized the sending and receiving of money to make it fast, secure, and cheap. This allowed people to become their own banks. The slaves were finally freed from their dependence on banks and the banksters. The very same protocol that allowed fail-proof money transactions was also used to transfer any series of numbers representing anything they want. People were suddenly able to write and transfer contracts to each other without having to rely on lawyers. They were suddenly able to write and transfer votes to a polling booth for just-in-time voting on any issue and at any time without having to rely on politicians. Once they found themselves free from banksters, lawyers, and politicians, they had finally broke free from their chains that enslaved them for so long.